I'm Adam, Field CTO, Managed Services at WatchGuard. We are going to talk about Akira. If you don't know who they are, that's fine. I'm going to break down who they are, what they've done over the past few years, and why it's important to think about what the lessons that they're teaching us as we think about our firewalls and remote access security. So let's start with the basics. Over the past several years, you may have, if you're not a WatchGuard firewall user, but you've used other firewalls, you've seen a lot of different vulnerabilities and exploits that have showed up every time that there's something related to an SSL VPN. VPNs have been something that the firewall has included almost since inception. And one of the things that we love about the VPN is that it was supposed to provide a simple and secure access into internal resources. But as Akira is sort of teaching us over the past couple of years, regardless of the firewall, there's almost always a cyber attack that they seem to be able to launch based on some sort of vulnerability present in the firewalls. In 2020, we saw this with Cisco and the AnyConnect client, as well as the ASA family, firepower threat defense type of firewall, so even the more modern ones. They had Akira demonstrate intrusions by essentially customers not upgrading vulnerable versions of those firewalls, which allowed them to access the SSL VPN just like a user would, and then breach the firewall and use that firewall as a beachhead to get into the internal network. Similar things happened with Fortinet back in 2021 and Cisco again in 2023. There was a pretty big advisory when Palo Alto Networks had discovered a similar type of issue in 2024, where remote code execution, meaning they could run software on the actual firewall source code and take over the firewall's management plane, basically allowing it a beachhead again into the internal networks of Palo Alto customers. You didn't necessarily see Akira in there, but then Avanti, or AKA Pulse Secure, also had a similar vulnerability, and very recently, of course, in 2024, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency had released a Stop Ransomware Akira notice or bulletin explaining how this adversary was going through and taking over firewalls using SSL VPN and a bunch of different remote access services. Why this is sort of heated up is that while those attacks were something that have been sort of a mainstay of firewalls, you just sort of upgrade them. There's usually one or two sort of vulnerabilities a year per firewall. That was kind of the cadence of these things, or the frequency over the past few years. But recently, a lot of different abuses have been discovered. So if you've been tracking SonicWall SSL VPN abuses, a number of those abuses throughout the 24-25 year had been linked to the Akira ransomware gang. And this gang is a very adept gang at getting into vulnerable firewalls using the SSL VPN, essentially leveraging some of the CVEs that have been published even lately. And even though the companies are working really hard, including companies like ours, to patch these vulnerabilities as soon as they come up or we discover them, that still gives the attacker time between our knowledge of the vulnerability, as well as even when it's disclosed, the time between you and patching it. And so Akira has been basically demonstrating a few of the flaws that are now what we consider structural, right? An issue with the SSL VPN that requires that we don't just patch it, but we think of a new architecture to avoid having to use this vulnerable protocol when accessing our internal networks. So Akira is teaching us in demonstrating these attacks, and of course, pivoting internally to these networks. What they're really showing us is that the perimeter firewalls with traditional SSL VPN are now a vector of attack. And this isn't something that I think most people would acknowledge. They would think, the firewall is secure. The SSL VPN is something that, has a very high encryption grade and is going to allow us, a smart authentication using things like multi-factor authentication. But what they're discovering is that the firewalls themselves and the ports that are listening for those SSL connections in the first place have a number of different things that they can try over the course of several months until they discover vulnerabilities that allow them to breach the SSL protocol, potentially, get into the operating system and pivot internally. So the first thing is that the SSL VPN and that traditional way of accessing the internal network across every firewall family, including WatchGuards, is something that we probably can't consider, secure. On top of that, we're very well aware that they can con remote workers who are connected from home or on the road using phishing links or password capture links and other types of malicious software that they phish them with through social engineering, whether that's unauthorized Teams chat, whether that's an email, WhatsApp message. There's so many different ways that they can connect to your at-home user, and none of the traffic that's sent from those applications is something that the traditional firewall at the edge in the office or coloco is going to see, right? So that's the first point, is that the firewall architecture is sort of blind to at-home traffic, which they can use to phish us, and the SSL VPN is a vulnerability that we now need to deal with on an ongoing basis. The second thing is that once they pivot into the internal network, most of the time, when they're facing a traditional endpoint security product, they can sort of either run over it. When they get to an advanced endpoint security product, like an EDR, they themselves, Akira, will recommend after people pay the ransom that they monitor those logs. They monitor the EDR because, as anybody knows, even some of the best EDRs on the planet are, upwards of 99% effective at blocking cyber attacks. But if you allow them months or weeks to attempt every single aspect of the network, they will find unprotected endpoints on the internal network, right? Things like a VMware hypervisor or a voice over IP system or other ways of, getting around the network. And then, of course, if they get under VMware and encrypt all those workloads, then, they're going to be successful in their ransomware attack, which is one of the ways that they've been successful over the past several years at still providing ransomware, even if their particular malware doesn't beat most of the anti-malware products like WatchGuard EPDR. Third, the organization, Akira, realizes that MFA is something that most people deploy either with a token or a push app, sometimes just two-factor authentication with a text message, and that this creates a cookie that allows the attacker, the user, access to cloud applications, right? So that you don't have to log in every time you make a request to the web app. Now, this authentication protocol is also something that Akira is wise to and understands how to be able to capture those cookies as they're created and then bypass access getting to things like Microsoft 365, even when tools like conditional access are in place. And that once they're actually in the environment, they tend to do their work very, very quickly, right? They're automating a lot of their attacks. They've got very good playbooks to find and breach the systems that matter and capture data very quickly with things like e-discovery scans and 365, so that whether or not they actually encrypt and create business disruption, they also have a capability to threaten you to expose your customer data. And so as you go through some of their dialogues, like I do in the article that I wrote, you can see exactly how it is that they discuss this ransomware negotiations with the users, with the victims, and that basically once they have access to your data, that's enough for most of that extortion. So while these four things may seem disheartening for cybersecurity teams that have invested in the firewall and have invested in things like endpoint security and MFA, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are sort of hopeless or helpless when it comes to defeating this gang. You just have to follow their advice proactively. So when we look at how the action plan should be built, the concept behind how we're supposed to defend against this adversary is by looking at the ways that we must modernize to find the new ways of doing these things from an architecture perspective. So first, with the cloud enabled firewall, right? The idea that the Firebox and the new T Series coming out has been something that we've kept up to date. The important thing is to make sure you do not fall behind, right? Falling behind simply doesn't mean, oh, we'll just get to that budget item later and upgrade when it's convenient. You're giving the attackers an opportunity when things aren't patched or sitting there in a sort of vulnerable state to breach that environment, right? So avoid using end of service hardware, upgrade and patch. If you've logged into the WatchGuard cloud even this morning, likely you were presented with a patch for this very problem, right? So the idea is that you should Deploy the patches frequently. That's the second thing, right? Update your firewalls frequently. So rely on the new versions of hardware, make sure that they can get those updates. And then once you can, make sure that you're deploying those updates frequently. So if you're not getting the threat advisories, you're not getting those notices when you log into the WatchGuard cloud, try to make sure that you're on top of that, because that's going to be a big step in making sure you avoid the very lazy ability for their bots to find those vulnerabilities and then try to exploit them. Third, what I'm here to sort of talk about and demonstrate today is that we didn't simply sit idle and wait for Akira to find a vulnerability in SSL VPN and breach it over and over and over again over the past 4 years, right? The idea is that there is a way for customers to modify the architecture for the VPN to avoid this altogether, right? The tool that we've developed to do this is a new tool called FireCloud Total Access. This will change the abilities for the attackers to reach the actual edge firewalls by switching to a modern architecture where the firewall does not have any inbound connections to it to provide remote access. And we'll demonstrate what that, I'm going to walk through how that works in just a second. And fourth, that once those firewalls have sort of leveraged the new total access or a different design, you are on your way to something called zero trust, right? The idea that every single endpoint or user is essentially prosecuted or inspected continuously to make sure that they're not allowed access to resources unless they pass a whole bunch of different security checks, and that this is something that applies not just to remote access, but things like internal lateral movement, access to the cloud, and other areas that typically go forgotten when you think about the word zero trust. You typically think client firewall application. And while that's not far from the truth, that firewall has to be between the application, which is where something like total access can really give you a head start on things like cloud or SaaS apps. So let's walk a little bit through one of the goals of this webinar was to try to understand that this is a problem that is now persisting across many different firewalls. This is something that is not unique to any one vendor. So while I've mentioned several on this call, including ourselves, the idea is that you want to be proactive in adjusting to these new designs, because even though Akira and ransomware gangs like them have found vulnerabilities in the SSL VPN and have been exploiting them, that doesn't mean that the rest of this tooling can simply be forgotten once the firewall is upgraded and we move to total access. The idea is that you want to be proactive in these upgrades, because the cost is usually 10 to 20 times what it is to upgrade something like a Firebox or upgrade to a FireCloud Total Access design for just dollars a user, as opposed to potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, as is the average ransomware demand and payment. If you watch their victim negotiations, most people think they don't pay, but a lot of victims unfortunately have to in order to get their systems back. While we don't recommend paying, it's just some a factor of that life. And on top of that, it could cost you operational downtime and incident response time from a consultant that could cost a lot more money. So being proactive really does save a lot of time and energy when something like this happens. And there are known multiples here to kind of describe exactly what that cost actually is. Now, for us, obviously, this means that when you think about our product stack, you can think of it more so in terms of how we've designed it to get between the adversary, in this case, somebody like the Akira ransomware gang, and your application, right? This is all the places that WatchGuard will need to be in order for us to be successful, right? So if we look at where we sort of began, almost 30 years ago in the 90s, protecting kind of the edge, what we were sort of finding and blocking threats to were internet traffic, inbound internet traffic, the concept of email and web being the predominant use at that time. And then as the application moved, right, we needed to move to protect it as well. So as we virtualized and moved the application over to, let's say, the internal virtual machines, we had an ability to develop Firebox V, a virtual firewall platform, as well as our EDR technology through the acquisition of Panda, that allowed us to police traffic between host to host, right, or server to server and client to server on the internal network without having to, let's say, put a giant piece of iron between the virtual data center and the user. Now, as you kind of think about your modern architecture, your cloud and the SaaS era is the one we're sort of living in. And This one really had identity at the forefront because companies needed to essentially provide, better conditional access to those resources when it came to things like, Office 365, Dropbox, SAP, other things that were now almost all sort of SaaS enabled, right? Or SaaS exclusive in some cases. And so being able to look at this technology and say, well, we've got this sort of model to get between the adversary and our application has typically gone forgotten. And the reason that most companies have not modernized to put a firewall between their remote user and the cloud is simply because they either rushed here during the pandemic and basically decided to remain in hybrid IT, but didn't invest a lot in designing the architecture for cybersecurity. They relied mostly on the cloud provider to issue a lot of the security controls. And in the shared responsibility, I don't think most cloud providers like Amazon, Microsoft, the hyperscalers had really communicated that this was something that needed to happen, right? That this was a necessary function of IT, was to say you need to put a SASE or some sort of other product at the edge. I think because they probably didn't see it as a problem they needed to solve. This was something that mostly people thought of about, protecting remote users, privacy, and internet traffic, and not necessarily protecting the SaaS app itself from connections from, let's say, an adversary, which is very much how you can use that tool and should, but most people sort of overlook that as a design consideration. And that as you look at ransomware gangs like Akira, it's important to understand that while it is a group of individuals and they are, an organized crime gang that is spread all over the world, they've been around for quite some time now, and they also have leverage to use some of the latest tools that we do as well, right? So when they go and try to automate their attacks and try to scale their own resources to make breaches happen at scale, they're going to start to leverage things like agentic systems, what are sort of an autonomous AI that basically can allow them to run these playbooks at scale, because it's not like they're exploiting a very different attack between customer A or customer B. They almost always have the similar, 100 type of applications, and that allows them to sort of, refine their practice, make things a little bit easier in terms of scaling things, which just presents a bigger problem for all of us, because what that means is the attacks are going to happen more quickly, more cheaply for them, and we have to be ready constantly to be able to deal with this. So in response to that, of course, WatchGuard and the acquisition of Akira built an agentic SOC that allows us to detect and respond to threats at scale, so that when adversaries like Akira pivot to that AI model, we'll be there to sort of block them at scale. Now, we're going to very quickly just remind people that this isn't, an evolution where you can only evolve in one area, right? The idea is that for all the products that are made at WatchGuard and the different places that you have to get between the adversary and the application, that this is really part of a platform that is there to deliver this zero trust model to companies that don't have the time or energy or the dollars to try to do this with 5, 6, 7 different products and their own custom integrations, especially for MSPs that are looking to deliver a profitable business model on stopping cyber threats for their small customers. It makes a lot more sense to push as much as they can into the platform. So just like we did with the firewall by pushing more services into it, like IPS, URL filtering, zero trust application services, all those things that we pushed into the firewall, of course, we have to push other arenas into the platform, such as things like the SaaS with FireCloud Total Access, or internal network with something like network detection and response. And so as you think about the approach to saying, well, we want to go and deploy this stuff, what's the best way to do it? One of the simplest ways we found is to try to leverage the technology that we've developed most recently, because those are the ones that are going to put us in a bigger position against the adversary getting into the environment with their more latest type of attacks. So if you think about a group like Akira, they're not necessarily leveraging an old school Windows 2003 vulnerability to get into the network. They're not leveraging, a trick bot and SMB. They're leveraging the way that the VPN can be breached at the edge. And so it's important for us to sort of model our defense around what's kind of a modern attack. So first step would be FireCloud Total Access. And then that kind of gets your foothold in the environment to try to expand the service to protect the internal network, as Akira would find, maybe new ways in through maybe something like a team viewer that you didn't block or something like that. So to draw this, sort of illustrate this on the screen, the concept here is that at the end of the development, of this zero trust journey, you would get to a position where you'd have a unified agent that would allow us to deploy a lot of those endpoint security, fire cloud network security, and identity security products to the end device, right? So Windows, Linux, Mac. And the idea is that you'd have that capability then in a sort of more hyperscale way of doing the telemetry ingestion, detection, and response with the WatchGuard cloud. And you'd have the ability then to set up enforcement points, right? When we say zero trust, we mean between the cloud per se and your user, between the internal network more securely with Firebox and FireCloud and what we're calling total access, and the concept that your internal network could also be protected by things like Firebox V and NDR, so that you're not sort of forsaking your non-agent installable devices like a voice over IP or a little manufacturing system that could leave your customers at risk. So let's talk about how you would implement this in a sort of very simple framework for deploying zero trust. The concept here is that you would first start by deploying the unified agent. If you think about, myself and pretty much anybody here at WatchGuard, we love this agent. I never leave home without it, right? So the idea is that, when the WatchGuard FireCloud total access is enabled, I can get remote access to resources like the firewall that's actually sitting in the cabinet behind me. And the idea that if I go to a malicious website or somebody sends me a link, that's going to be automatically blocked by the FireCloud service. So I've already got my traffic filtered coming to the internet, right? And every one of those cloud applications is now secured by FireCloud Total Access. What this does for me is that if somebody sends me a malicious link on my WhatsApp, or they send it to me in Teams, or they send it to me, in typically what we would consider out of band from a corporate access scenario, it's going to automatically be filtered and blocked by the FireCloud. This lowers the ability for the attacker to get to my end users and myself, frankly, by leveraging traditional malware exploits, other third-party applications that I want to be able to block. And so one of the ways that Akira has leveraged this is to impersonate help desk software, help desk personnel, and then install help desk software, right? Things like AnyDesk, TeamViewer, even GoToMeeting or things like that, these sort of support agents that would allow them to take control of the end user's machine and then essentially, start deploying malware or finding their way into the internal network or stealing data. But the idea behind FireCloud is that that has to happen from the outside. So even if they tried to con your users into doing that, a lot of those applications would be blocked, right? You could set up a simple policy that said, here's the applications we actually use. Nothing else should be able to run. Nothing else should be able to connect up to the internet. And then as the second step for total access, so that's FireCloud Internet Access, protecting cloud apps. The second thing is that you need to change the way that you connect to your Firebox. And so the idea is that for users that traditionally had used that agent to connect with a VPN client to that edge firewall, well, that's not the best design anymore, right? Any modern zero trust network access architecture is going to make it so that the Firebox actually makes a connection to a cloud service. And that's what brokers the conversation between the client and the applications that are stored on internal resources behind that firewall. That means that you can basically have no port that's open on that firewall listening for attackers to try their luck at finding a new vulnerability or exploiting an old one or brute forcing your users' passwords or any of those other things that you would have just by being able to find that, oh, there's a remotely accessible firewall and service port for SSL VPN. There's a million different things that they then try from that point. So just having those things not have anything listening means the bots can't find them. It means they can't send that malicious traffic towards them. It means that old protocol isn't enabled. And more importantly, you're now using new technology like WireGuard, which is a new protocol that makes it really, really fast for people to access the internet. One of the main reasons most people didn't backhaul VPNs in the pandemic was that they didn't have the performance on the firewall to handle all that traffic load coming into that little circuit they had in the office, and all the users at home 1 gig fiber internet blasting 10 100 gigs at that firewall. So now, regardless of the sort of bandwidth at your customer at your end users, wherever they are on the road or at home, they're going to have a much more performant way of accessing securely applications on the internet and of course in the cloud without any split tunnel It's fully backhauled, everything's secured and decrypted, another key aspect of this. And so that's going to be your sort of primary defense here, is getting this design in place, on top of course, patching your fireboxes and keeping those hardware tools up to date. Once that's done, you basically have, from the cloud, control to deploy other things, right? So you have this idea behind being able to deploy, let's say, EPDR to your virtual systems with that unified agent. It's a very simple sort of service push. With the NDR, which is network detection and response, you can start to look at things like lateral movement behind the firewall that it typically can't see because it's not seeing all the east-west traffic. And then things like Firebox V or other agents that you can deploy inside of virtual machines to protect them from attack, assuming that you still have virtual machines in a hybrid IT environment and want to do that. It also works, of course, if you are in a new modern cloud architecture like AWS or Azure and want to deploy the same security there as well. So to summarize, the concept behind FireCloud Total Access is to provide sort of an always-on protection for your users, regardless of where they are, and a new way to do remote access that avoids us falling victim to different kinds of SSL attacks from the Akira group. It provides better detection because it's got SSL inspection built in, meaning it decrypts the traffic automatically. Once you deploy the agent, it auto deploys SSL decryption, and that gives us the ability then to look at the traffic that are coming from things like your browsers or other apps. And that allows us to look at the links and the files that are maybe malware and strip them out for your users. This also gives us the ability to provide zero trust, meaning we can check things like the identity or the presence of an agent or all kinds of other great things to profile the types of connections we want to allow. Just by having those tools present, it makes it even harder to try to send malicious, malware or links or other things to the end user. And it gives us much more control, especially if you're running things like managed detection and response, where I work, to help us find and block the actual, attacker from moving forward in the environment by isolating devices or disabling accounts or resetting connections that they may have control of. This is also going to optimize your performance. It can't be stated enough. Most people did not do this for one fact, and that's just it didn't have the performance on their internet circuit to do this. So this removes the bottleneck that is internet access and VPN access simultaneously, while maintaining a very high performance speed for your users using things like WatchGuard. It is easy and flexible to deploy, so you do not have to connect it to your Firebox to use it. You can just provide, internet access only. It still is a great tool for that. But the idea is that there are points of presence or POPs all over the world that make this a very simple thing to deploy regardless of which city you find yourself in. And that because this is done through the WatchGuard cloud, very similar to the way you administer your firewalls and updates and policy today, you do have the concept of being able to push new tools through the unified agent, have the capability to set up policy that is exactly the same as the policy you would set up on your fireboxes in the Fire Cloud. So you would have the same level of protection, just a lot more performance, and on probably where 90% of your traffic actually is, which is out there on the internet. So quick little architecture visibility here, just to drive the point home. When a user connects, they would be connecting whether to the cloud or to the internal applications. It would be seamless. The user experience is going to be a lot better. They only really have one sort of always on type of VPN. They don't really have to like dial in and then connect and then start all their little drive connections. They just have it sort of auto launch. And then the idea is that all the traffic that they have destined for the internet and internally is protected simultaneously. Now, one of the things that we also had worked on is a little agent called Zero Trust Auditor. What this does is launch pretty much a safe version of the malware check that I launched over here. So it is this tiny little tool here that can check if you're able to block, a virus, if you're able to, do detection and response, if you're able to block network traffic, to an encrypted URL. And so all of this really is just something that simplifies by clicking through these. If you contact your sales engineer, they should be able to run through it with you. It runs you through how mature your actual life cycle actually is. Are you on a firewall or a firewall design that can protect your network? Are you running an endpoint that can stop more modern attacks? Do you have monitoring of that endpoint to take additional actions on edge cases like an MDR? Are you able to validate your cloud access to things like 365 and still protect access there, like with FireCloud Total Access? Do you have, identity systems that, don't just leave you victim to password attacks, but have more complex ways of setting up multi-factor authentication to stop attacks that, target the end user's password, which is quite crackable and probably on the dark web already. So this definitely shows the strengths, just being able to like contact the sales engineer and walk through those use cases without having to like go through getting like, let's say, engineering diagrams or network diagrams from your customer staff, which may not be up to date and frankly, give you a very difficult and expensive time to try to tell them how this works, when you could simply run the agent and say, see, because you're at home, there's no protection of your tool, your laptop connecting through your home internet insecurely to the rest of the cloud. So it makes it pretty straightforward for people to understand where their gaps are and how best to close them. That's it for the presentation. I will pivot over to questions now. Am I still there? Sorry, team. GoToMeeting crash. All right, questions. I want to ask about WatchGuard. It will be an option on fireboxes. Yes. So the idea behind the WatchGuard technology is that it will be available on the fireboxes. WatchGuard also will be the technology that is used to connect with the internet access, so the FireCloud access to the internet apps. So you not just the firewall, but also the firewall in the cloud now called FireCloud. How can I sign up for FireCloud Total Access? Talk to your sales engineer, and they will be the ones to tell you exactly how to get access to it, when you can get access to it, how to set up trials of it, how to design any one of those scenarios that I talked about. If you don't know who your sales engineer is, reach out to us and we will tell you. Or your CAM. Your CAM is probably better. Any other questions about Akira, about some of the architecture that I discussed, any of the WatchGuard specific technologies questions or data sheet questions? Some of the ones I get are, is the decryption going to still require deployment of things like certificates? No. With the agent, as you deploy the FireCloud agent, the certificates come down with it. So it's not as, custom as the one on the Firebox. If you don't know any of your WatchGuard folk, wait till the end of this webinar and send us a question there. We'll try to reach out to you specifically. We probably need a little bit more private information from you than I want to accept on this chat, but yeah, reach out there and we'll hook you up with somebody. So the certificate thing, yeah, a lot easier to deploy, just the agent, a lot more straightforward for anybody that's ever set up SSL decryption on their firewall in the past. That was a huge win for me as an engineer. One of the things that I found quite difficult was managing how certificates worked for each app and the operating system and everything else. And we were trying to do it before, and it would kill the power on a lot of the firewalls I was doing it with because they, didn't have a lot of decryption chips put in there. and tended to give me weird certificate warnings for my users. So there's a lot of exceptions. This is a lot more straightforward. Okay, I am a newbie. At this level of security implementation, what I'm seeing is currently update firewall. Yes, update the firewall from a hardware and make sure the software is updated. So, good, you captured the first step. So if you're not on a current supported version of WatchGuard hardware, make sure you upgrade to the new one so you can get updates. Then go through the cloud, push updates. We try to make that as simple as possible. Put it right in front of you when you log into the console, so you don't have to have too much skill to figure out how to go from there. Second would be FireCloud Total Access, which is the agent. So the agent, what we're trying to move to is a model here around what's called a unified agent, right? So you have one agent that can deploy multiple services. You can then decide what services go down there. My suggestion in the presentation was to start with FireCloud Total Access. That way you sort of restore the network visibility to things like cloud applications, but you also change the way that remote access on your firewall, if you have a VPN enabled on your firewall, works. And by changing the way that that works so that the firewall is making an outbound connection instead of listening for inbound ones, really saves you a lot of vulnerability risk from these attacker groups coming and breaking into the firewall using them. And then yes, your next 2 and 3 would be correct. So number 1, update the firewall hardware software. 2, look at total access, which modernizes the way that VPN connections or SASE, like remote access connections, would happen for your users. And then with that unified agent now on your operating system, you can decide whether you want to add EDR, add auth point identity for things like multi-factor authentication. And then that really gets you on your way to securing endpoints wherever they are and setting up a policy between them and the applications, which should include the cloud and internal. Questions still coming in. So that was the I'm a newbie question. MDR, so once you have, managed detection and response where I work, you need data to make that happen. So like at the minimum, even though I've recommended this from a network security perspective, because frankly, most of our customers, given our history, are using our firewalls, that this is how you modernize the firewall architecture, and that puts you in a position now to drop the endpoint on there. Once that's happening, once you have the endpoint and the firewall going, even if you just have, frankly, EDR going, you can then add managed detection and response. So it does go, basically, a managed detection and response just has to follow the endpoint product. But yes, so you can put it in at any time. And mostly, if the question started with I'm a newbie, you kind of understand the point, right? It would be better if Akira was facing somebody who has beaten them many times than somebody who's never seen them before and what they're doing. So that's that managed detection and response team. Our agentic SOC and 24/7 people are there to sort of find and block that. What you need is the endpoint to do that. Steve says, is there some costing info to look at for these services to get the ballpark idea of cost per user? Absolutely. The difference is, unfortunately, there's so many different ways that we try to help our partners by using different financial models, everything from a point system, which is sort of like a pay-as-you-go, buy now, pay later type of thing. The other aspect of it is that things can come in tiers. So it's best to connect with like a sales engineer or a CAM, and they will definitely give you transparently pricing and show you all the ways that you can, trial the products, demonstrate the value of the products, build bundles so that you're very well aware of what the product costs, what the margin typically is, how you kind of build out your services there. So there's a ton of playbooks that we have here to help enable partners who are not just looking for, a price, but like, okay, there's so many different business models. How can you attach to mine? Mine's based on user, mine's based on endpoint, mine's based on bandwidth, mine's based on a managed service contract per firewall, right? So there could be a lot of different ways that you want to see that pricing fit in. But if you're just simply looking for like sticker MSRP price, yeah, talk to a CAM and they'll help you out. Let me just see if I missed something here. For this framework to work, the Firebox must be cloud managed. Yes, it should be cloud managed to move away from the if you want to leverage FireCloud. So the idea is that if you wanted to say, I'm going to do all my internet traffic for my users using one agent VPN over to the Firebox, you'd need to make sure it was cloud managed. Now, for some customers, they still have the on-prem only version of things. There's lots of ways to migrate from that. Of course, if you have older hardware, that was sort of the first thing, is that we really do need to get into in-service hardware. But if you do have in-service hardware and you're connecting it to the cloud, if the issue is more like compliance, we have a lot of different compliance regulations, and we do a lot to make sure that it's secure once it's in the WatchGuard cloud. But yeah, the cloud management does need to be there for a lot of the things I was talking about, because then you can't deploy the policy to all the firewalls. The updates are a little bit more difficult. There's just so many different things that the cloud gives you. But yeah, I could understand some people are sort of a little apprehensive about the security and the compliance. The compliance, ISO 27001, PCI, GDPR. We have a European data center, an American one. Like, there's a lot of different ways that you can look at, trusting the cloud. Which, let's face it, if you're on the internet today, you're trusting a bunch of different clouds. You just aren't really aware of where all the hosting is for OpenAI or Microsoft or whatever. And while they're very big companies, everybody assumes they're doing a lot of the compliance regulations. They're still leaving you vulnerable to these attacks in the first place, which is why you need companies like WatchGuard to get in between. So yes, you need the cloud. That was probably a little too much for that answer, but that's how that works. Any more questions about the product, the design, the SKUs, anything to do with deployment? Most of these products, by the way, to get a little deeper on the licensing question, are licensed based on the number of endpoints. So it's an easy way to sort of build your model from that if you're new to this. But certainly the concept for us is that everything, even including MDR, is sort of like built off of the idea that like you do have an endpoint that's coming in through the product, and that's really how you want to try to build out your unit costs, because it just, everything kind of comes back to the idea that they're going to have some way of flowing through, and that's the vector for the attack, is what they're on and what it's connecting to. So the application and the adversary, usually to get between that, you have to be on the endpoint and within the network and in control of those places. Okay. If you can't think of any more questions, guys, I really appreciate you jumping on and going through this with me. We are going to have many others. There's another webinar tomorrow even. But the idea is, if you have questions and I didn't answer them today, make sure to reach out at the end of the webinar. We're going to try to send a bunch of links to make that easy for you to do. And hopefully we'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much for listening.